Welcome, everybody. I'm Sarah Pritchard, president of the Caxton Club. We're lurching gradually into spring here in Chicago, and it is wonderful to have so many of you able to join us in person and via Zoom. Thank you in advance to our speaker, Professor Ian Gadd, to Doug Fitzgerald, the chair of the Midday Programs Committee, and to Zarko Mladenovic, our video and Zoom manager. Before Doug introduces the program, I would like to extend a special welcome to the newest members of the Caxton Club for this month. Please see the slide that will be shown. I'm so grateful that we have ongoing influx of new members. Please reach out when you are online or at a meeting. Friendly collegiality is why we get together. Any visitors online are welcome to go to our website to find out how to join. Doug will say more about Ian Gadd in a moment, but I would like to point out that, among other things, he is a faculty member at the University of Virginia Rare Book School, and we are proud that the Caxton Club is an active supporter of Virginia Rare Book School, both as a club and through many individual Caxtonians. So Professor Gadd has a wonderfully foundational and appropriate topic to talk to us about today. Thank you all, and now over to Doug.
Hi, I'm Doug Fitzgerald, and I'm sitting here today on a clothing rack, a piece of exercise equipment that has a remarkable quality about it. As fast as you go, you're always in the same place. That's because it is stationary. And that kind of stationary is what we're going to be talking about. Excuse me? Spelled a different way. Two ways to I'm in a stationery store where today we're going to be talking about how to use beautiful pieces of paper to send each other proper note. What? That's not it either? Charter? Royal Charter? Royal. We're at Burger King, which is the subject of today. No, not this either. Dairy Queen? Oh, okay, I give up. I think I'll let our speaker tell us what today's program is going to be about, and I believe that's a pretty wise decision. Our speaker today joins us from Bath, England, which used to be Roman, but has settled down and become stationary. Ian Gadd is a professor of English literature at Bath Spa University. A friend of the club, Dr. Gadd holds degrees from the universities of Pennsylvania, Go Quakers, Edinburgh, Go Uni, and Oxford, Go Blues. He is a bibliographer and book historian and is on the faculty at Rare Book School, which is always well done. His CV is longer than a Faulkner sentence, and his reputation is so international that he has been singled out for a tariff of his own. So let's find out what the program is really all about. Ian?
Hello, everyone. I'm really honoured to be here with you today. This is not the first time I've addressed the Caxton Club. I was there in person back in 2011, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to address you again, but this time on a different topic. And I want to thank in particular John Chalmers, who I've known for many years and was my introduction to the Caxton Club, to Doug Fitzgerald for arranging this talk, and to Zarko for his technical wizardry in making sure that all of this should hopefully work smoothly. So as you can see from the slide, my focus today is the Stationers' Company, and that's a London-based organisation whose history can be traced back over a mere 620 years and which is active to this very day. And I want to start or use as my sort of central motif the Stationers' Company website of all things, and particularly the subtitle, The City of London Livery Company for the Communications and Content Industries. And I want to interrogate that and to ask, what does it mean and what does it tell us about the history of the Stationers' Company? And in what follows, I'm going to focus primarily on the 16th and 18th, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. I'm not going to present a chronological history, partly because frankly, that will get a bit tedious, but also it will take quite a long time because there's a lot of detail. And I'd much prefer to get into the detail in discussions. But instead, what I want to do is explore what the company was, and that is not necessarily a straightforward answer, and give you a sense of why I think it's one of the most important cultural institutions in English history. So on this subtitle, let's start with the City of London, which of course for many years was just known as London. That is the urbanized area that is roughly circumscribed by the city gates and walls that stretched from, in the west, Fleet Street, to the Tower of London in the east, from Smithfield and Spitalfields at the northern edges of the city, to Southwark on the south side of the River Thames. And I'm showing you a map here. This is quite a famous map. Some of you will have seen it in a coloured form. This is monochrome, but as good detail, taken from the British Museum's map collection. And if I highlight it, you'll get a sense of, for those of you who know your London geography, whether that's through having walked it or recognise it on a map. We've got here, right in the centre, St Paul's Cathedral. To the east, the Tower of London, and that urbanized blob there is the City of London. And if you look closely, you should be able to see the city walls, although the urban spread of the city extends beyond that, and so did the jurisdiction of the City of London. And to the west, you have the City of Westminster, which was a separate jurisdiction. And of course, as the city itself grew, and I'll show you in a moment, the two cities connected and now, of course, have completely dwarfed those two twinned cities. At this point in the 1570s, the population of the City of London was about 100,000, and it was during the next century that it began to grow dramatically. And here we are 150 years later, 1720, and there's no longer any visible distinction between the cities of Westminster and London. At this point, it's still small in comparison to modern London, but the population is 5 times as large, about 500,000 already. The City of London had and continues to have its own distinctive system of governance. At the top of that is the annually elected mayor, which is not to be confused with the London mayor, a political appointment, which is a modern invention. So we have the Lord Mayor and aldermen representing different districts within the City of London. And a key part of the governance structure for the City of London is or was the livery company. And this is what brings me to the next couple of terms on that stationers company subtitle. Now, a livery company, first of all, had nothing to do with horses. And the company bit did not really mean it was a commercial entity, although some of the companies did have commercial interests. Instead, a livery company was a craft or trade body recognized by the city authorities, recognized by the City of London. And here is a list of companies in the 1630s taken from the Survey of London. Some of you may know John Stow's Survey of London from the 1590s and early 17th century. This is a later edition. And here on the right-hand side, you can see dozens of companies, all the way from the Armourers Company through to the Woolpackers Company. And the range of crafts and trades represented, and in particular, the differentiation of particular crafts, such as those involved with the cloth trade and the leather trade, into separate companies. That gives you an insight into the nature of London's economy in the 1630s. It also highlights, although it's not obvious from this list here, but it highlights that there was a very clear hierarchy to the companies. There are 60 or 70 of them, but they know their place. And at the very top of the list were a dozen companies, the so-called Great 12, which were the most powerful and the richest in the city. And they comprised, in order, 1 to 12, mercers, grocers, drapers, fishmongers, goldsmiths, skinners, merchant tailors, haberdashers, salters, ironmongers, vintners, and cloth workers. And it was from their ranks that the Lord Mayor was annually chosen. So these were the most important livery companies in the city. The stationers company, though, was ranked quite low down, partly because, as we shall see, it started very modestly, but also because it was a little newer than the Great 12 in particular. So the stationers company itself was ranked around the mid 40s. It's currently ranked 47th. And although now there's not much conflict around the hierarchy, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, many companies that were further down the pecking order did get a little bit upset about their particular position, and the stationers company was one of those. So most of these companies, but not quite all, most of them were livery companies. In other words, they had been granted the right by the city to wear livery, that is, distinctive gowns at civic events during the year, but also critically to be able to vote on the election or in the election of the Lord Mayor. And they had some other political rights as well. And every year, these livery companies took part in the Lord Mayor's show, which was a very grand citywide procession that saw the formal installation of that year's Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor's show continues to this very day, but in the 17th and 18th century, it involved a dramatic waterborne parade along the Thames, with many of the companies having their own barges. And here, for example, is the Stationers Company barge as it looked in the early 19th century. Generally speaking, all the London livery companies, including the Stationers Company, had the same basic structure. There was a large cohort of freemen who were also citizens of London, and then a smaller cohort of liverymen who had more privileges, including the right to attend and participate in those civic processions and to vote on the Lord Mayor. So you had the freemen, a liveryman, a privileged class within the company, and then they were governed by a small executive group called the Court of Assistants, all of whom were appointed for life. And from the court, the master and wardens of the company were elected every year. And this is true whether you were in the mercers or the goldsmiths, as if you were, as well as in the stationers company. Many of the London livery companies had their own hall in the city, and that was for meetings and events, but it was also a place of administration, and many companies, livery companies, had their own employees, most notably a clerk, whose primary role was to manage the company's records and operational activities. But what did these livery companies actually do? And they combined many roles, and it's really important that we don't anachronistically define them in too narrow terms, because they were a trade union of sorts, but they were also an employers association. In other words, they included the bosses and the workforce. Now, of course, in pre-industrial England, the economic structure was very different to what emerged following the Industrial Revolution, and we shouldn't over-romanticize the idea that the membership of these organizations was either very divided or very equal. These companies, or membership in these companies, represented a very wide spectrum of wealth and power, and particularly into the 17th and 18th century, there seems to be quite a lot of structural inequality in the companies. You see complaints about this. But nonetheless, every master, as in the chief executive of the company, had started in the same way as a freeman and had, to an extent, worked their way up the ranks of the company itself. Crucially, the livery companies were responsible for training London's workforce through apprenticeships primarily. Apprentices were bound to their masters through the companies, and once they'd completed their apprenticeship, they would then become a freeman in their master's company and, by extension, become a citizen of London. The two were linked. You couldn't be a citizen of London without having membership of a London company. The company's management of apprenticeship was overseen by the city as a whole, and the city was there for disputes or for setting various basic sort of regulatory frameworks around apprenticeship. But in practice, And on a day-to-day basis, apprenticeship was essentially a company matter. And so, again, this was as true for the stationers' company as for any other London livery company. The companies were important in providing welfare for their members, and that could range from loans to young freemen as they were starting out on their career. It could include handouts to freemen who'd fallen on hard times, possibly through economic difficulties or ill health. And it also included pensions for widows of members. Companies also provided welfare more broadly. This is pre-industrial England. This is before any sort of national welfare system. And many of the companies, for example, manage what we would now consider to be charitable foundations on behalf of deceased freemen or other citizens of London. The livery companies were a critical part of the city's administrative system, and there were very good pragmatic reasons for this. The companies were the most numerous secular, that is, non-religious organizations in London, and their collective membership numbered tens of thousands. So they would be a very efficient way for the city to announce or implement a particular policy or decision. And so companies raised loans for the city or for the crown. They stored corn and gunpowder. They maintained arsenals. They conscripted soldiers, and they invested in international initiatives, including the colonization of Northern Ireland and even the east coast of America. And here I want to show you an inventory from the Stationers' Company in 1558 that shows, alongside the kinds of things that you'd expect any craft or trade organization to have in their hall, we have weapons here. We have guns, we have bow and arrows, we have swords, we have spears, we have pikes, and we have daggers. And here is a really rare surviving example of a livery company weapon, a Civil War musket from the Royal Collection that, although you can't see it really here, but I have seen the original, the coat of arms there is the coat of arms of the Stationers' Company. So this was a musket that at some point was in the holdings of the Stationers' Company. And during the English Civil War, London became Parliament's economic and administrative headquarters, and the company halls, for example, were taken over by various parliamentary departments, and the livery companies themselves were subject to repeated demands for money to support the war effort. The companies provided an important social space, especially for those more privileged members, i.e. the liverymen. There were regular social gatherings for feasts, for sermons, and for other celebrations. But the halls could also be hired out to freemen and to the local community for things like weddings and wakes and so on. And of course, the companies, the livery companies, were also regulators of their respective crafts and trades. The scope and nature of those regulatory powers were determined by the city authorities for the most part. But for some companies where they were in receipt of a royal charter, it was the crown that defined their regulatory powers. In nearly all cases, regardless of where their authority came from for their regulatory power, the company's jurisdiction didn't really extend beyond the city walls. Obviously, London, the City of London itself, couldn't grant powers beyond its own jurisdiction, but the vast majority of livery companies that had royal charters, their jurisdiction didn't extend much beyond a few miles outside London. And there was a consequence to this, which was as the city outgrew, as in the urbanization, the urban development of the city outgrew the formal jurisdiction of the City of London authorities. As you remember that map that showed that Westminster and the City of London were now a single sort of urban development, it became harder and harder for those companies to impose their regulatory powers. There were, though, some exceptions. There were a few livery companies whose regulatory powers were much, much more extensive and in effect were monopolistic. And as we shall see, the Stationers' Company was one of those examples. And then finally, although it was not common at all, companies could set up their own commercial operations. And again, the Stationers' Company is an interesting example of a company that did just that. So I've taken some time to explain what a, quote, City of London livery company was. And I've done that for a variety of reasons. First, as I hope it's been self-evident from what I've been saying, it's not obvious what these terms precisely mean. City of London isn't the same as London as we understand it. A livery company isn't quite the same as a commercial entity. But the other reason I've dwelt on this is that for many, many decades, scholars who were interested in the history of printing and publishing in the 16th and 17th and 18th century London tended to see the Stationers' Company as either a state body, i.e., the Crown directly managed it, or as some kind of free-floating entity whose structure and functions were wholly determined by its members. In other words, that it was a sort of fully autonomous, independent, isolated organization. And even for those scholars, of which there weren't many, who acknowledged that there were other livery companies, the assumption was nearly always that the Stationers' Company was still fundamentally different to other livery companies. And the research I've been doing over the last 3 decades and the work of Peter Blaney, who I will cite a little later, our work pushes back against that, because although there were differences between the Stationers' Company and other companies, as there were between the Pewterers' Company and the Drapers' Company, for example, there were a lot of similarities, and many of those similarities had a very pragmatic purpose, because the Stationers' Company, just like any other livery company, had to fit within the existing administrative, economic, social, and governance system of the city. And so we shouldn't over exceptionalize the Stationers' Company, and we should recognize that some of the things that we might see as unusual aspects of its activities were actually pretty standard for other London companies. So that deals with the City of London Livery Company bit of the subtitle here. But let's turn to the communications and content industries, which of course is a very 21st century description of what the company is now. But it's worth spending a bit of time now explaining just what the Stationers' Company's craft and trade reach was and how it developed. The foundation of the Stationers' Company is taken as 1403, when the city authorities first recognized the right of 3 specific groups of craftsmen and tradesmen to amalgamate into a single formal organization. Text writers, in other words, non-legal scribes. So legal scribes in this period were called scriveners. Text writers were those who wrote manuscripts but were not writing legal documents. Limners, that is, illuminators of manuscripts. And then those who bind and sell books, so bookbinders and booksellers. This is quite a wordy description for this group. And by 1441, so just under 4 decades after this, this combination of book trades and book crafts was being referred to as, quote, the Stationers' Company. And I'm happy in the discussion to talk a little bit about why the name stationer was hit upon and why it stuck, as opposed to other terms that were in use at this time. Those of you, I imagine all of you on this who are listening to this will know very well, 1403 and even 1441, printing has not yet arrived in Europe and definitely not arrived in England. And this is really important. It's something that Peter Blaney has pointed out. Just because printing was a way of making books, that didn't mean that when printing arrived in London, that the Stationers' Company had any automatic right to regulate printing as a technology and as a trade or craft. And what I mean by that is that if you remember that long list of livery companies and all the differentiation, particularly in trades and crafts involving cloth and leather. There were several different companies that regulated the cloth trade at different points in terms of the production and sale and distribution of cloth. So, although to us it seems self-evident that printing should be tightly linked with other activities around bookmaking and bookselling, printing itself as a craft was not something that would automatically fall under the Stationers' Company jurisdiction. And in fact, for the first 80 years that printing was active in England, no single livery company had a regulatory jurisdiction over the craft. So William Caxton was not a stationer. He was not a member of the Stationers' Company. He was, in fact, a member of the Mercers' Company, which was the company at the very top of the livery company hierarchy. His apprentice, Wynkyn de Worde, was a stationer or became a stationer, but many other early printers and publishers in the first half of the 16th century belonged to other companies, especially the Drapers' Company, which was the third-ranked company in London. And again, to cite Peter Blaney, during that first 50 years of the 16th century, there were more printers in London who belonged to non-stationers' companies. In other words, they belonged to companies other than the Stationers' Company. There were more printers with that affiliation than printers who belonged to the Stationers' Company itself. But then in the middle of the 16th century, something extraordinary happened. It was extraordinary in terms of the development of the English church and in terms of English history. Mary Tudor, the Catholic daughter of Henry VIII, becomes Queen of England in 1553. And for a period of 5 years, England is subject to a counter-reformation. But the impact on the book trade, particularly the printing craft, almost overnight, those non-stationer printers, in other words, those who were printing but were not members of the Stationers' Company, who nearly all of whom rather had wedded themselves to the reformist Edward VI, they were suddenly no longer the powerful bloc that they once were, because their religious affiliation was no longer the one in ascendancy. And Peter Blaney describes this process in some detail, but to summarize, the Stationers' Company was able finally to secure a royal charter of incorporation. So it had never been incorporated up at this point. Up until 1557, its authority was derived purely from the City of London, did not have a crown charter, a royal charter. So in 1557, the Stationers' Company is incorporated, and that grants them not only regulatory oversight of printing. In other words, now printing has suddenly become part of a company's jurisdiction. And that meant that, according to the charter, only members of the company and those who had printing privileges direct from the crown, so there were obviously some who had got those privileges already, only those could print. But alongside that, the company also got a national jurisdiction over printing. So it could enforce that monopoly pretty much across the country. And in 1557, there were only 2 other companies that had a national jurisdiction through their royal charters. One was the Pewterers' Company and the other was the Goldsmith Company. And I want to quote from Peter Blaney, partly because Peter Blaney's prose is always worth quoting, just to summarize exactly what 1557 represents in terms of the sudden change of fortunes for the company and the powers that it got as a result. So the printing monopoly the company enjoyed from 1557 was not something the stationers achieved by successfully eliminating their alien competitors and provincial rivals until the field was theirs alone. It was something they had to ask the crown to confer on them. Left decisively behind in the race to lead the book-driven Edwardian Reformation, within a month of their 150th anniversary, so in other words, in 1553, they the Stationers' Company suddenly and unexpectedly found themselves the last printers standing after the Marian Purge had culled all the winners. And that monopoly, a national monopoly in effect, over printing, with exceptions being made for the university printers in Oxford and Cambridge, that meant that printing was confined to London pretty much for the next 150 years until 1695, when, with the lapsing of the Printing Act, finally provincial printers were allowed to establish themselves for the first time. And that is, I think, almost, well, probably unique within European printing history. Other countries in Europe, there was a much more widespread activity or establishment of printing houses across those the countries, whereas in England, with the exception of Oxford and Cambridge, between 1557 and 1695, you have essentially a London monopoly on printing, and by that on publishing itself. And so 1557 to 1695 represents the company, a period for the company when it was at its strongest in regulatory terms. And during that period, practically every important printer and publisher in London was a member of the company. But the enforcement of the company's regulatory powers, and as we all know, regulation is one thing, it's the enforcement that matters. The enforcement was not straightforward and it was not continuous. And not only did national and city politics intervene at multiple points during those years, and I'm happy to highlight some of those for some extraordinary moments, but also critically, the state got more and more involved in the regulation of printing and publishing itself. And those regulations that you start seeing from the 1580s onwards, they do always acknowledge the Stationers' Company, but they undermined its powers by shifting the ultimate authority for that regulation from the company to the church, to the crown, and eventually to Parliament. And as soon as the authority, the ultimate authority, is shifted, then anything that happens with those regulations, the company itself no longer has an ability to step in. And so whenever the crown or parliament, or whenever the crown's or parliament's authority was disrupted, say during the Civil War, or it was removed, as in the case of when the Printing Act lapsed in 1695, the company had no real mechanism to reassert its own powers. I mentioned earlier that most of the livery companies in London had their own hall. And in 1557, the company also had a hall to the southwest of St. Paul's, directly to the southwest of St. Paul's. So here's a 16th century woodcut map, the so-called Agas map, and you can see a pre-Sir Christopher Wren St. Paul's, and immediately to the lower left, one of the buildings there is the Stationers' Hall, and you can see here from Peter Blaney's The Bookshops in Paul's Cross Churchyard. This is the bird's eye view. You can see just to the west of the west side of St. Paul's, you see a small building there called Stationers' Hall. By the early 17th century, though, the company had moved. They've moved to much larger premises in Ave Maria Lane, which you can just see here on the left-hand side of the map. And you can see this Google satellite image. The Stationers' Hall is marked here, and you can also see just how close it is to St. Paul's. And this is an outside shot of the hall. And this is where the hall remains to this day. It's been rebuilt both after the Fire of London, and it was also damaged during the Second World War. And the hall itself continues to hold events on behalf of the company. It also, not uniquely, but it's one of a handful of London livery companies that holds their own archive in situ rather than with the London Metropolitan Archives. The company's membership in the 1550s was about 120 freemen, so not very big. By the end of the 17th century, we can estimate that it was probably over 700. And it continued to grow for reasons I'll come back to. And by 1800s, it was probably around 1,500 members. So well over 10 times the size of the company when it was incorporated in 1557. It's important, though, and this is one of these little quirks of London practice that often throws later scholars, because of the ways in which it was possible to become a London citizen. So you could, obviously, most London citizens came through apprenticeship, but you could also become a citizen through your father if they were already a citizen when you were born. And you could take your father's company even if you'd been trained in a different trade. And so it was perfectly possible for the member of one London company to follow the trade regulated by another. And so that means that you can find members of the London book trade in the 16th, 17th, and 17th centuries in practically every other London company. And just to give you a sense of that, here is a list. I realize the text is quite small, but in 1685, the company drew up a list of all the members of the book trade that they knew about that were members of other companies. So you've got the fishmongers, goldsmiths, skinners, merchant tailors, haberdashers, leather sellers, barber surgeons, cutlers, girdlers, embroiderers, blacksmiths, joiners, and weavers. And the member of the weavers company was one Joseph Moxon, whose mechanic exercises some of you will know as the first printing manual in English. And just to show that it could go the other way, looking at the records of the members of the stationers' company, we know that there were many who didn't pursue anything to do with the book trade. And so you've got a list here, everything from baker and barber to weaver and wine cooper. But they were all members of the stationers' company. So it's important that when you see a reference to somebody being a member of the stationers' company, you do not assume that that means that they are a printer or a bookseller or a bookbinder. The chances are they were. That was the largest group by far, but it is entirely possible that they were a different, they followed a different trade. Similarly, you may well come across members of the London book trade who were actually members of other London companies. Of the members of the company in the 16th and 17th century, nearly all of them were, as you would expect, men. However, in the second half of the 17th century, you do see women being bound as apprentices, being made free, in other words, becoming freemen, in quotation marks, and in turn binding their own apprentices. But the number is tiny. Less than 1% of apprentices in this period are women. That said, and this is an important caveat to that, although women formerly couldn't own property, it was London custom, a very pragmatic custom, that widows of citizens could be allowed to carry on their husband's business for as long as they remained a widow. In other words, they didn't marry. And we know of many widows active in the book trade. And extrapolating from that, we can both affirm with some certainty that many women were active partners in book trades or bookcraft businesses alongside their husbands. And we only perhaps see them when they become a widow, but then even if they remarry, they may well carry on being a kind of key part of the printing house or bookshop. I've spoken for, probably about 25 minutes or so, and I haven't yet mentioned the single most famous aspect of the stationers' company, namely the stationers' register, in which members of the company from 1557 onwards recorded their rights to publish specific works. Now, I've held that back for a couple of reasons, partly because I wanted to demonstrate that the company was far more than simply a single set of records, regardless of how valuable those records have been to later scholars, and also to highlight the way in which the company's operations and then its character, its motivations, its decisions were to protect its members' economic interests and to support their social obligations well beyond the management of publishing rights. But the Stationers Register's story is an important one, and it takes us back to that period prior to the incorporation of the company in 1557. And it's a story that is told in Peter Blaney's magisterial 2-volume history of the company between 1501 and 1557. And to summarize, from about 1510 onwards, English printers and booksellers who wanted to protect their rights to publish a particular work, their only solution to that was to seek a privilege, usually from the Crown, in certain instances from local city authorities. But the vast majority of these privileges were issued by the Crown. And remember, as I've said, at this period, printing does not fall under any London Livery Company jurisdiction. So there was no way of a livery company controlling who could print what. Instead, you had to go to a higher authority, city authorities, or, as I said, for most cases, the Crown. That process of securing a privilege was bureaucratic, it was costly, and it was valuable to the Crown as a result. There wasn't any kind of mechanism for ensuring that privileges didn't clash. Really, if you could secure a privilege and then you discovered it was competing with another privilege, you'd have to go to court in order to unpick that. And there was no easy process for resolution if somebody broached your privilege. Disputes would ultimately have to be settled by formal legal proceedings. So it worked for very lucrative privileges, ones where there was a lot of money at stake and you were a wealthy printer or publisher. But for smaller books or smaller genres, it was pretty cumbersome. So if you wanted to create a system for protecting publishing rights, an alternative model was to create a system that was operated by trusted members of the book trade, that had sufficient authority among the trade as a whole, that was reliable, that was easy and was relatively cheap, had a straightforward mechanism for resolving disagreements, and crucially didn't interfere or challenge with any existing or future Crown privileges. And that sort of wish list was met in many ways by a London Livery Company, because a livery company was ideally placed to develop such a system. It had an established authority, it maintained records, it had a system for arbitrating disputes. The disputes was one of the things that London Livery Company spent a lot of time doing, unpicking economic disputes or labor disputes or whatever. But it also had, because of its communal nature, it had a really deep-seated ethos of mutual social obligation and equity that always sought to balance an individual's commercial interests with the well-being of the trade as a whole. So the livery company and the stationers company was, as it were, almost ready-made for such a system. But before you could do this, the stationers company had to be given jurisdiction over printing. And it was that happened in 1557. And so it's only when the incorporation happens that the stationers register can be established. It's worth noting that although the stationers register, the creation of it and the maintenance of it and the register itself runs all the way up to the early 20th century, is a really significant moment in the history of the book trade, and as we shall see in the development of Anglo-American copyright. Printing privileges continued anyway, and the Crown continued to issue and recognize privileges into the 18th century. And so the right to be the king or queen's printer, for example, was granted by privilege. There are privileges also issued for things like law books, school books, and so on. The stationers company itself had its own privileges. It was granted in the early 17th century the privilege to publish a range of genres, including, crucially, school books and almanacs. And off the back of that, it set up its own commercial entity, a joint stock company, the so-called English stock, that just managed the publishing of those books. And the English stock became enormously lucrative, so much so that, and I mentioned that the London companies began to lose their regulatory power from the end of the 17th into the early 18th century as the city itself grew. That's true for the stationers company. Its regulatory powers wane in the 18th century. But because the English stock was so valuable, membership of the Stationers' Company not only remained strong, it grew because freemen were keen to secure one of its shares. And the company protected the English stock fiercely. And a lot of its decisions in the 17th and 18th century seem to be taken with one and sometimes both eyes on the impact on the English stock. And one of the ways that you see this is that the university presses that had their own privileges, the company came to terms with, contracted with the companies and paid with the company contracted with the universities to pay an annual fee so that the universities didn't infringe the patent. And it was only in 1775 that those exclusive rights were overturned. But even then, the English stock continued and was only wound up in the 1960s. Right, let's return to the Stationers' Register. So the procedure for the first 150 years after it was established was as follows. Before printing a new work, a member had to seek permission from an officer of the company. He also had to pay the clerk an extra fee to enter that permission into the company's records. And those written entries, which eventually became sufficiently important to warrant their own separate volumes, so you go to the Stationers' Hall and you can see the multiple volumes of the register, they become what we know as the Stationers' Register. And once those rights, the copy, once those rights were granted, no other member of the Stationers' Company was allowed to publish that work without permission of the owner. And if they did, the owner could seek redress from the company. Now, it's really important, and again, something that many scholars misunderstand, that authorization was separate from the state system of pre-publication licensing, in other words, of censorship. The vast majority of these copies were entered by members of the Stationers' Company, but during at least the first 50 years or so, it was possible for other members of the London book trade to enter copies in their own name. And it's not until 1637 that entrance in the register was made compulsory. So that again deals with another myth about the Stationers' Company and the Stationers' Register. The fact that a publication doesn't appear in the Stationers' Register pre-1637 does not mean that the copy is illegitimate or illicit, but rather the freeman hadn't paid the extra fee to have the entry recorded formally in the register. Why would you do that? You would do that if you thought that this was something you might need to protect for later years. But if it was simply something you thought you'd sell now and you didn't really think about the longer term, you would save your extra money and not get it entered formally in the register. And the copy had commercial value because it protected one's publications from unauthorized reprinting. And so a separate market for copy becomes or develops. And these copies could be leased, they could be mortgaged, subdivided, bought, sold, bequeathed, and so on. And by the second half of the 17th century, it was entirely possible to become a very successful publisher, primarily by acquiring and managing existing copies rather than publishing new works. And the register, therefore, was a fundamental part of the management and protection of these copies. And this is why you see the register being named in multiple Crown and parliamentary regulations about the book trade throughout the 17th century. And it's why it's placed so centrally in the Copyright Act of 1710.
The title to the copy of such book or books hereafter published shall before such publication be entered in the register book of the Company of Stationers in such manner as hath been usual, which register book shall at all times be kept at the hall of the said company.
So I hope you found the account that I've given of interest, and I wanted to show that while for us it's the cultural value of the books that were produced by the printers and publishers who belong to the Stationers' Company, it's that which makes us interested in the Stationers' Company. It's important to bear in mind that the company's own interests and its own activities and decisions were far more wide-ranging and diverse than many scholars have assumed. And the Stationers' Company was just one amongst many livery companies in this period. It was not the most important. It wasn't the largest or the richest or the most powerful. And also, we need to remember that the history of the Stationers' Company is not quite the same as the history of the English book trade or of English printing or English censorship or even of the history of the book in England. It forms a really important part of all those stories, but it is wider than any one of those histories. And so the Stationers' Company needs to be understood as an organization that was interested in more than just books, and that consequently many of its decisions, many of its practices relating to books, the things that we find most interesting, these need to always be seen within a broader perspective. And that, I hope, is what I have provided for you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for a wonderful presentation. We're going to go right into question time. Please enter any questions that you have via the chat feature, and Zarko will read them one at a time. So take it away, Zarko.
Ian, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. Slightly cringing having listened to myself for 50 minutes, but I hope people found it interesting.
Oh, absolutely. They're going to have so many questions. So let me hit you off with the first one. You said you'd be willing to talk about how the Stationers became so named. Could you take us through it?
Well, so it is an unusual name. There are, if we look at the long list of livery companies in the 16th and 17th century, the vast majority of them, you can identify exactly the trade or craft from the name. Stationer is a generic term, and it's one of those where the kind of narrow definition that we now associate with stationer and stationery, that comes later. So the idea of stationers as paper sellers only really becomes associated with the term in the later part of the 17th century. Up until then, you would have references to things to paper stationer, but a little bit earlier. But the association between stationery products and stationers comes later in its history. We don't really know why this generic label appears. There is some thought that it's to do with the way that stalls were, or the members of the book trade used stalls outside, particularly around St. Paul's, to sell. So it became associated with that. But lots of other crafts and trades had stalls. So it's not an absolutely clear-cut definition. It may come from the universities. And a particular term that was used to describe where one could get one's manuscripts copied. So we don't really know. What we do know is that by that sort of 1440s and well into the 17th century, it becomes a generic term. So you could say somebody is a stationer, and that can mean they are associated with the book trade in whatever sense. And then it's only in the later 17th century into the 18th century that you start seeing it being used to describe a particular subset of the book trades.
Many of the companies founded schools. Do you know why the Stationers did not?
Well, no, they did. They just didn't do it at that early on in their history. So there is a stationer school. I think it's founded in the 19th century. And as a side note, the association between education and the livery companies of London is a very long-standing one, and it speaks to that both that sort of sense of social obligation that the companies have from the outset, that the importance of providing welfare, which could extend to educational provision. The Stationers' Company, for example, provided scholarships to go to Oxford and Cambridge in the 16th and 17th centuries. So you have that strong connection. You also have, which I think is a really important part of why the London companies and organizations like this are so pervasive, not just in London, but also in cities across Europe. Those, as soon as a body is incorporated, as all of you know, it gets a legal personality, which allows it to own property and to enter into contracts and so on. And that, although it can be dissolved, it also can extend well beyond a single human lifespan. So a lot of bequests, particularly in the 16th and 17th century post-Reformation, a lot of bequests were given to London companies because this was a way of an individual knowing that their legacy could endure well beyond not only their lifetime but beyond. And so you do get bequests that are specifically linked to educational projects. And so some of those are linked with the more wealthy companies, but the Stationers' Company, as I said, in later in its history, establishes a Stationers' Company.
Ian, are there any online resources or databases you can recommend for searching for members of any of these companies, such as goldsmiths, drapers, etc.? Or is that kind of query best done with in-person records?
So there are some very good online records. The London Livery Company records, for obvious reasons, are invaluable to genealogists. So genealogists have been all over them for a while. And the reason for that is not only do they give you a name, but apprenticeship records will include the name of one's father. They will include the occupation of that father. They will include notice of whether that father is alive or dead at the time of apprenticeship. And they will also include the parish from which the apprentice comes. You can also estimate the age of the apprentice based on the length of term, usually 7 years, but sometimes can be longer, the length of term that an apprentice was bound for. So you get that, you get quite a lot of rich biographical detail just from the apprenticeship records. So genealogists have been poring over those for a while. And there is a online search tool called Rollco, ROLLCO, which is a searchable database of freemen and apprentices across many London companies, not all of them by any, not I think it's about a dozen or so, including the Stationers' Company. That gives you fairly basic data. The Stationers' Company, partly because of the fact that we all are really interested in printing and publishing, those records are available in lots of different forms. So yes, they're a part of that record, that online tool. But if you want something that's more granular, you have the apprenticeship, the catalogues of apprenticeships and freemen that Don Mackenzie published, the first volume through the Bibliographical Society of Virginia, and then the second through the Oxford Bibliographical Society. And those cover the period from 1605 through to 1800. So you have some printed, any good reference library will have copies of those. They're indexed. They're not searchable in quite the same way that a digital text is, but they're much richer. They're much better in terms of detail than the ones that you can access through the London online source.
We have a long question from one of our members, and she would like to ask you that question in person. So let me just unmute Soma. Soma, if you can try and talk right now, let's see if your microphone works. Let's try that again. You just hit the unmute button.
Thank you, Zarko. Dr. Gadd, that was very interesting. I have a question about recusant Bibles, because this is all going on during this time. So when those Bibles were printed, you said the first charter was given around 1557, and then it was renewed by Charles II, like around 1684, correct? So when those Bibles were printed, if you get a royal charter, they wouldn't be printing those Bibles whatsoever, correct? Because I think you hinted upon it and I couldn't catch it because of religious beliefs. Because I think it affects who's printing the King James Bible, who's printing the other Bibles. That aspect interests me deeply. Could you speak on that a bit?
Yes.
Thank
So no, that's a really interesting question, and it goes to or it highlights some of the complexity around the company's reach and jurisdiction. So Bible printing, that is official Bible printing. That's not illicit Bible printing or Bibles that are imported from Europe, elsewhere in Europe, across the Channel. Official Bible printing is the responsibility. It belongs to whoever is the royal printer, whoever has the privilege for king or queen's printer, and that persists throughout the from the early 16th century. The Bible is one of the first genres of work to be covered by privilege, for obvious reasons, both because it allows for a degree of standardization about its authority, but also it is an incredibly lucrative genre. You are printing Bibles in numbers and in sizes and so on that is far greater than any other type of book. So that the right to print Bibles, official Bibles in English, is not held by the stationers' companies, held by individuals who are receiving privileges from direct from the crown. There comes a point in the later 16th century where the Queen's printer, and then latterly in the 17th century, the King's printer, where they are also members of the stationers' company. But the stationers' company has no rights over the Bible. It doesn't have any regulatory authority over that. If there are any infringements of that privilege, it's for the King's or Queen's printer to take action in their own name, not through the stationers' company. There's a lot of anxiety about Bible printing and the sources of, how Bibles are, the quality of Bible printing, and there are lots of interesting examples of badly printed Bibles in the 17th century in particular. There's also a lot of concern about the smuggling in of more cheaply printed and also therefore more Bibles that are cheaper to buy, so undercutting the Bible, the official Bible trade. You also have, and this gets a bit tangled, but it shows you again how complex this is. The King's printer or Queen's printer had the right to print Bibles. Oxford and Cambridge both had general privileges to print. They could print anything, which technically meant they could also print Bibles as well. And this causes a problem. The king can't be wrong. He can't give two privileges in this way. And so there's a way in which the university presses initially kind of get into dispute with the owners of the King's or Queen's printer over who has the right to publish Bibles. And in the end, there's a fudge. Oxford and Cambridge are allowed to print certain kinds of Bibles. And then in the 18th century, the kind of complexity of that becomes even more intense. But so it's a kind of peculiar thing that the Bible, despite it being so important in the book trade from economic purposes, as well as obviously, in terms of crown and church interest, it actually, the stationers' company has no direct involvement in the publication of or production of Bibles. They do have an interest in the sale of them. Their booksellers will be selling Bibles, and so they have an interest in trying to protect the Bible market, book trade market. But the company itself does not have an active interest in the production of Bibles.
Thank you, Ian. We're going to segue to Union League Club. Union League Club, hello, how are you doing? Anybody has questions? Okay, let's raise your hand and then we'll do one by one. Sarah, do you have a question?
No, just
No, okay,
waiting.
I saw your hand raised. Anybody else in the room has a question? Raise your hand. If you do not, we'll just go back to Zoom. I think you just left everybody speechless.
Darko?
Yes, if you
I'm
could
John
speak up.
Chalmers, and
John, could you speak up or maybe come close to the microphone?
okay. My question is that the station's company did own a patent. Tell us about Almanac Day.
Thank you, John. Very good to see you. Very good to see you. There's you have amongst your midst another expert on the company. So uh, 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 do ask him questions, particularly in the 18th century, where my knowledge is a little bit weaker. So Almanac Day. Well, first of all, we all know what almanacs are. And I said that the Bible trade is very lucrative. At the other end of the shall we say the kind of cultural spectrum, you have almanacs, which were enormously popular, enormously lucrative. By definition, you would buy one every year, so it was a very useful and valuable trade. The right to print almanacs becomes part of the English stock, that joint stock venture that the Stationers' Company establishes in the early 17th century, and they protect their interests in almanacs, also school books, and other titles, but particularly almanacs, all the way up to 1775. The publication of almanacs, and therefore the as it were, the dividends that came from almanacs through the English stock. So members of the English stock had shares, and they would get a very lucrative return, 12.5% every year. And I think we'd all love to have 12.5% return on any investment at the moment. And those shares were you could, and this was a kind of crucial part of their value. If you as the male stationer died, the share could be retained by your widow. And so every quarter day, the shareholders would gather in Stationers' Hall to get their quarterly dividend. And so the almanacs in particular were so vital to that. So the payment of those dividends and the amount of money that came through the almanac trade was exceptional. In 1775, the court case that overturns their monopoly, a court case which is brought by Thomas Carnan, who had, I think, a certain justifiable grievance. He was blackballed against, he wanted to become a liveryman, I think it was a liveryman rather than a freeman, but he was blackballed by the company. And he took out some of his resentment by challenging the almanac monopoly. It goes up the chain of legal courts, and it is claimed that the company offered him £10,000 to drop the almanac case, which on the face of it seems a kind of ridiculous amount of money. But actually, if you look at and think about how much money the English stock was generating year on year, that is actually it could have been a genuine offer. If the offer was made, he refused, and the almanac trade was overturned. And as a side note, one of the unusual examples of unintended consequences, that almanac, that the privilege falls as a consequence of that. The money that's being paid to Oxford and Cambridge by the London trade to ensure that their privileges at Oxford and Cambridge don't infringe the London trade, that those annual sums, which by then were substantial and were the single largest source of income for the universities, those fail. There are crisis talks at Oxford and Cambridge that involve the Prime Minister, and within 2-3 years, there's a rider added to the a Stamp Duty Act that guarantees income, a payment of income to the universities. So the state funding of higher education in the UK starts then, and that so it's one of many examples where the stationers company has a hand in something of national importance, in this case through a rather indirect route.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions from the Union Elite Club? No, nobody. Okay, Doug, we have one more question from Zoom, and then I will let you close the program. Just give me one moment. Ian, this is kind of like a comment and a question in one, so I will just read it the way it was written. I took your RBS course a few years ago, highly recommended. And this was a fabulous refresher. Because of your course, I often reflect on the social, economic, political organization that the livery companies model offered earlier societies. Do you think those models offer something for us today, either as an ideal or as a cautionary tale?
Thank you, Beppe, and thank you for the shout out for my RBS course, which is running this summer. So, I mean, I could do another lecture on this, and actually there'd be other people that would be economic historians who've worked on the livery company model. I had a private question during the talk about are the livery companies like guilds in elsewhere in Europe? And actually, yes, the guild as a term applies here. We don't use it to describe these organizations in England, because in this period, guild means something that is religious in focus, a religious organization. But essentially, the guild structure, which you see in cities across Europe, that model is very similar. There may be local variations according to the relationship with the city authorities. And thanks to Adam Smith in particular, and a kind of capitalist perspective about labor in in the workforce, guilds have had a bad rap for about 250 years because they were seen as monopolistic. They were seen as conservative in terms of innovation, and they were seen as a backward form of economic structure. And in the last sort of decade or so, there a bit longer than that, perhaps, there's been a concerted effort from economic historians, including there's a fabulous book just out by a colleague who I worked with for many years on various projects, Patrick Wallace, now at the LSE, London School of Economics, on apprenticeship and the importance of apprenticeship. And so there's a lot of reappraisal of guilds, looking at particularly the way in which they were valuable educators, that they kept regulatory standards, and also that they and this there's debate to be had about how innovative or how conservative they were. There are examples of innovation through guilds, and there's also examples of clear kind of technological conservatism through guilds. But I think particularly the kind of social and educational aspect of guilds, they are organizations that have enormous commitment to social and educational training and welfare, and we don't want to over romanticize that, but it is something that I think is a really striking part of their history. And I feel sometimes that the kind of Adam Smith approach to guilds, what that does is it reduces them to purely economic organizations, when actually the economic side of things was not only just part of what they were doing, but actually it was underpinned by an ethos of solidarity and fraternity that gets overlooked, I think, by scholars, and as a result, you miss the value of that, and tend to think of the individuals as purely kind of economic agents, and I think that undermines our understanding of the companies. And I think, yes, perhaps to go back to your kind of the implication of your question, it suggests that these kind of organizations that there is a value in complex organization that respects and understands fraternity solidarity alongside matters relating to trade and or to relating to craft and trade.
Yeah, and I'd just like to thank you so much for answering all our questions. This was wonderful. I just also want to thank Ryan for sorting out all the technical difficulties we had at the Union League Club. Thank you, Ryan. And I'll just leave it to Doug Fitzgerald to for any closing remarks about this meeting.
Well, thank you all for attending, and we need to be aware that Ian joined us from a very different time zone, and we've been keeping him from his Friday evening dinner. And so I'll apologize to your wife if she becomes angry and anything got burned. So thank you very much for the time that you so generously shared with us. It is a tradition of the Caxton Club to provide each speaker with one of our own publications that has been signed by all physically present, and I'll be sending you that. And also want to thank Zarko for his many contributions, a lot of which you just don't see on screen, but he does a lot of remarkable things off camera, and we appreciate that. Looking forward to seeing everybody again. Please join us in June. We'll be actually heading back to England. It'll be a little bit of a Coles to Newcastle event as we learn about the book forger and about how he took advantage in particular of one Caxton member. So if you like a good mystery story, please join us in June. Thanks, everybody, and take care.
Thank you so much.